Okay, hello everyone. This is Ask a Washington Beekeeper. I am Margot Buckles. I am a volunteer with WASBA, the Washington State Beekeepers Association, and we are presenting tonight Priya Chakrabarti Basu, a assistant professor at the Department of Entomology at Washington State University. Priya is also courtesy faculty at Oregon State University. She studies the interactive aspects of multiple stressors on bees, for example, poor nutrition, pesticides, climate change, and diseases. She uses a wide variety of multidisciplinary techniques across fields such as physiology, toxicology, functional biology, multiomics-based approaches, and neuroethology to address her research questions. She's currently the Secretary-Treasurer of the American Association of Professional Apiculturists, the Vice President-elect of the PBT section of the Entomological Society of America, and the North American Chair of the Nutrition Task Force for CALUS, the International Bee Organization. She was also the past chair of the Early Careers Professionals Committee of the Entomological Society of America and the vice president of Mississippi Entomological Association. In addition to the research community, Priya also enjoys teaching and working with stakeholders, policymakers, and the general community in protecting bee pollinators and raising pollinator awareness. Priya is also a children's book author, something I did not know until this very minute, to help spread pollinator awareness among young readers. More information about her lab's research can be found at www.priyadarshan. I assume that's, oh, I
It's
cannot
going to
tell.
be on my lab website.
Yes, and I will put it into the chat. I'm sorry, I can't.
No, all good. And to be honest, I still have to update that lab website.
So anyways, without any further ado, here is Priya talking about honeybee nutrition.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk about bee nutrition today. So, I am going to mostly talk about supplemental feeding because we are at that point when we are approaching peak summer, and there might be a shortage of both pollen and nectar in the landscape, but also we have to start thinking about what should we do to better nutritionally manage our colonies, summer, fall, and then overwintering. So, today my talk is primarily going to focus on supplemental feeding and colony nutritional management. When we talk about honeybee colonies in general, we have all heard about how we have lost close to 1.6 million hives during the past year between June to March of this year, and it is a massive loss. On an average, even the commercial beekeepers are reporting about 62% colony losses. I hope your bees are doing better. But when we do talk about this colony loss, there are multiple stressors that are impacting it. We can think about pests, parasites, pathogens, diseases, poor nutrition, pesticides, adverse weather conditions, and whatnot. All of these stressors are either acting alone or they are acting in synergy with each other to cause further stress. So, if you're actually looking at these gray arrows, you will see that a lot of them are bidirectional, implying that truly, when you think about this multiple stressor sort of phenomenon, they are all interacting with each other in many different ways. And this is where our lab we come in. In our lab, we are obviously not only studying bee nutrition, we are one of the leading labs for bee nutrition experiments. We look at what are the nutrients in the landscape, how are they shaping bee health. We also study bee toxicity. What are safe tank mixes? How can we better protect pollinators? We study the impacts of the environment on bees, heat, drought, wildfires. And in addition, primarily, most importantly, we are also interested in looking at these impacts of the multiple stressors. So we study, for example, how can poor nutrition, pesticides impact bee gut microbiome, or varroa, poor nutrition and pesticides, they might be interacting with each other. So in any different combinations, we are always interested in understanding how these different stressors are impacting bees. So we not only study individual bees in laboratory cages, we also look at the effects on the overall colony. While this seemed to be a lot of basic research, but truly we work at that interface of both basic and applied sciences. At the end of the day, every question we ask, we follow it up with, so what? So what we are finding in such impacts of these stressors? What can we do to make things better for beekeepers? So that's where we come in. We not only study all of these problems from a holistic level, but we also dig deep and we try and come out with actionable measures. What could be done to help protect bees better? Which is why today's talk is going to be all about how can we manage bees better using nutrition as a tool. So going back to that same slide, even though I'm talking about all of these stressors being on the same platform, I truly believe that poor nutrition should be at the very top of it. We must think about bees exactly how we think about ourselves. Humans and bees are very alike when it comes to nutrition. We are what we eat, and it's exactly the same for bees. If the colony is well fed, it has access to optimal nutrition, it can fight off other stressors better. It has better immunity, it has better longevity, and it is actually much stronger to be able to counteract the impacts of all of these other different types of negative stressors. Which is why I truly think that poor nutrition should probably be somewhere on the top of this chart. If you're looking at the honeybee colony loss data, percent affected by these different stressors, as reported by USDA NAS, which is National Agricultural Statistics Service, this is the chart that you're probably going to come across in that report, where clearly we have these different categories why. Due to a certain stressor, we may have lost colonies across different time points in the year. And this was the latest data sets that I could come across between 23 and 24. So varroa mites, other pests and parasites, diseases, pesticides. And then we have this large group which is clubbed together as other unknown. You're not even going to see poor nutrition as a part of this. This is basically the concept that I am trying to break. Poor nutrition actually is contributing to not only that other unknown group that you're seeing here, but it has a very important role to play for each of these individual stressors. Bees that are better fed can fight off a lot of these other stressors much better than bees which do not have access to optimal nutrition. If you go and look up that same NAS reports, they also have information on the honey reports that they publish every year. So NAS is actually a sort of like a part of USDA, and you can go in and you can look at all of the statistical data and you can look at all of the reports across US agriculture. Honey report is a part of it. In 2023, the table that you're looking at, and if you can't read it because the font size is small, I basically pulled the table out of their honey report from 24. But if you cannot read it, let me walk you through it. What you're looking at is the annual income and expenditure for US beekeepers for 2021 and 2022. This box that I have highlighted in red is the annual expenditure of US beekeepers for providing supplemental feed to the colonies, which includes syrup, sugar water, honey, pollen patties, and any and all other types of feed. Beekeepers have been spending a staggering amount of anywhere between $42 to $45 million annually in providing supplemental feed to their colonies. Treatment for varroa mite and hives woodenware are about a third or less of this expenditure annually. Similarly, if you're looking at the 2025 report, you're going to see what US beekeepers have spent in 23 and 24. This section highlighted once more in the red box shows you that beekeepers have spent between $45 to $47 million in providing supplemental feed to the colonies, more than what they have spent in 21 and 22. Clearly, this is a problem. Not only our colonies need access to better natural forage in the landscape, and I wish I had time to talk to you about some volunteering opportunities as citizen scientists, where you can help me build this map of the nutritional landscape for bees. But in any other case, not only bees need access to this better nutritional forage landscape, we also need to be able to better manage our colonies by providing them with cost effective and better management effective supplemental diets. We need to be able to nutritionally manage our colonies better to bring this cost down as much as we can. Especially when we are thinking about it from a honeybee colony perspective, nutrition as a concept is extremely complex because we are looking at these individual needs. Are they queens? Are they workers? Are they drones across all of these colonies? What life cycle stage? What age of even the workers that we are looking at? And of course, while you're looking at these individual needs, you also have to think about the colony as a whole. So there are these very different layers that you're looking at when you're thinking about honeybee nutrition. And for a colony, nutrition is obviously the first line of defense. Because as I keep repeating myself, there are so many studies out there from our lab and other labs which show that nutrition, optimal nutrition, can improve honeybee health. It can increase bee longevity, it can improve bee immunity, it also improves a bee's ability to counteract pesticide stress, pathogen stress, and other diseases. So essentially, optimal nutrition is very important when we are thinking about a colony's need. As beekeepers, we often don't consider nutritional management as a problem, as a stressor. Because we look at it as, oh, this is the time of the year where I have to provide sugar syrup or I have to provide a protein diet to the colony. But what happens if we don't feed? That colony will die. So while we think about providing the supplemental feeding as part of our beekeeping management practices, we really have to look at it from a different perspective and start realizing how important nutrition is. And of course, nutrition we know determines the castes in the colony. If a female larva is fed royal jelly throughout its larval period, it becomes a queen instead of a worker. So clearly, right from the larval stage, nutritional requirements for each individual as well as the colony as a whole is very critical. And most importantly, even though nutritional stress is an important factor in colony loss, it is still not thoroughly investigated. So while I'm talking about nutrition, what are the nutrients that bees need? We can broadly categorize them as macro and micronutrients. Macronutrients, as the name suggests, are of course required in larger amounts, and they're also very critical for bees. Examples include major lipids, carbohydrates, proteins. Micronutrients, on the other hand, are equally important, even though they are required in smaller amounts. Examples include phytosterols, phytochemicals, vitamins, minerals, salts. If you just look at this slide, you will see that everything that the bee needs, whether macronutrients or micronutrients, they are all present in the pollen or in the nectar. So essentially, an ideal forage habitat should be able to provide bees with all of the nutrients that they need. For any particular foraging trip, bees will commit to any one of these three resources usually, and they are going to forage the landscape looking for it. Pollen and nectar are quite often collected. They are providing proteins, lipids, micronutrients, as well as carbohydrates, trace amino acids. Water is also collected, especially during hot, dry summer months. So foragers tend to prefer water that is rich in minerals, rich in compounds, especially during pollen scarcity. So there are many ways that honeybees or any other bee species could be challenged in the landscape when it comes to nutrition. There could be a lack of pollen abundance. The quantity of pollen that is coming in is not enough. There could also be a lack of pollen diversity, meaning a lack in the macro and micronutrients that the bees need. In fact, there could also be a lack of pollen quality. We published a paper towards the beginning of this year, and we looked at the nutritional quality of two different blueberry varieties. So we looked at the pollen nutritional quality. And we found that in some cases, plants such as blueberries, and also from our previous studies, like in hybrid carrot seeds, their pollen is not as nutritionally good as when you're comparing it with maybe apples and cherries and almonds. So essentially, a lack in the quality of pollen is as problematic as a lack in pollen diversity and pollen abundance. And let's not forget nectar. Nectar is equally important. An insufficient nectar flow essentially means that bees are not getting enough carbohydrates, the sugars that they need, and nectar also has trace amino acids, minerals, and other phytochemicals that are also required by the bees. So, from a perspective of nutritional management, overwintering survival is extremely critical. And we can ensure that by making sure that the colony is well fed throughout the year and the colony has enough food reserves stored to be able to overwinter. And the overwintering honeybee workers, the diatoneous bees, who tend to be the longest surviving workers in a honeybee colony, they should also have enough food reserves stored within their body tissues. So I usually say that the three important parameters of a bee's ideal habitat are diverse, staggered, and abundant. Diverse meaning there is this diversity in so many different types of flowers. So a diversity in the macro and micronutrients that the flowers are providing through its pollen and nectar. Staggered bloom means something or the other is blooming in the landscape from the last frost to the first frost of the year. And then, of course, an abundant bloom will also provide a lot of pollen and nectar to the bees. And I keep reiterating that water is extremely critical because we often tend to overlook water. Water is, of course, needed for hydration, for cooling, and also to help reliquefy crystallized honey. But water is also critical because it can provide the minerals that bees need during times of pollen dearth. And a good example would be this video that you can see to your right. So I used to run this water fountain in one of my research apiaries on main campus. And I mean, of course, it's super cute because it looks like a skep, but it is actually extremely functional. I have pebbles and stones thrown at the bottom of that little shallow pool so that bees are not drowning. The flow of the water is pretty gentle. And you can also see that there are steps cut onto the side so bees can land. And I don't clean it in throughout the year. So basically, the bees are also having access to some minerals because I let moss, algae, anything that wants to grow on it just go wild. And because this is a constant flowing stream of water, I'm also not worried about mosquitoes or other larvae that are growing in there. To your left, you could also build a water feeding station for the bees without having anything like this. You could just have some sort of a container with rocks, pebbles, or maybe mesh hardware cloth thrown in there so that the bees are not drowning. Keep the water shallow. Don't try to clean out so that you have some sort of moss or algae growing on it. And let the water completely evaporate before you refill it. So that way, bees will always have access to this shallow water. So while I keep saying that diverse forage is obviously important because an artificial diet truly cannot replace pollen completely. Pollen has a ton of macro and micronutrients that may not be present in an artificial diet. And similarly, nectar has a lot of nutrients that just plain sugar syrup will be lacking. So as critical as natural forage is, so is supplemental feeding. It is extremely important that we are able to provide our colonies with proteins and carbohydrates when they need it during times of pollen and nectar dearth, because otherwise that colony will die. So supplemental feeding for colonies is extremely important. I have written this supplemental feeding guide, which is published through the Honeybee Health Coalition, and it is available online for free. So you can just Google for it, and you should be able to access it freely. What I am about to talk to you today, a lot of it is actually present in the supplemental feeding guide and in much more details because I will not have time to talk about all of this, but I am going to try and touch upon some of these important sections. So we know that naturally, when honeybees are collecting pollen, it is stored in the colony as bee bread. So this pollen is mixed with glandular secretions. It is carried on the hind leg pollen baskets, which are called corbiculae, and then the foraging worker honeybees store it in the hive as bee bread. So commercial diets will truly, in practice, never be as attractive as multifloral pollen because pollen has a lot of other nutrients. But even then, there are these wide varieties of commercial diets that are now found available in the market, which can try and meet some of these nutritional needs of the bees. These protein patties can either be pollen based, when we call them pollen supplements, or they can be non pollen based, and then they are called pollen substitutes. While both pollen supplements and pollen substitutes, they provide the proteins, and in many cases, they can also provide the lipids that are required for bees. Pollen has additional nutrients that may be scant or absent in these diets. However, it must be considered that natural pollen is difficult to procure in bulk and also at a reasonable cost. And then there are a lot of beekeepers who also worry about the risk for pathogen transmission. So, this is what I say. If you have a small number of colonies that can be reasonably managed, you can set out pollen traps during spring or the time of the year when you know that your colonies are going to bring in a ton of multifloral pollen. In fact, one of the pollen atlas projects that we are launching in the Pacific Northwest and nationally, it is called the Phenology Wheel Project, that actually helps map the pollen flow location by location, month after month, year by year. So this way, we can easily know when in the year, what time of the year there would be no pollen coming in, but also what time of the year we would have a lot of different types of pollen coming in. So you can place these pollen traps at your colony entrances. Do not starve a strong colony in particular, but switch out those pollen traps between colonies. Maybe put it out for 48 hours at a time, collect all of that pollen and put it in your freezer. So during times of pollen dearth, you could either make that into a pollen paddy if you have a small number of colonies, or you could mix that pollen into the commercial diets that you purchase and then you feed to the bees. So this way, you're basically feeding that same pollen that bees would have eaten maybe 3 months ago. So whatever pathogens, whatever things that they would have been exposed to, they are still being exposed to the same thing. You're not carrying any additional risks. And this might also save you some money in buying supplemental diets. Some research have shown that unlike pollen, these commercial diets are actually not stored in the colonies. In addition, these commercial diets are only eaten by a proportion of the adult honeybees in a hive, and they are never directly fed to the larvae, unlike bee bread. It is also traditionally believed that pollen-based supplemental protein patties are usually given to stimulate brood production, especially when you need the queens to lay eggs, typically in that season, but she's not doing that. So you can stimulate the colony to produce more brood by providing a pollen-based supplemental diet. However, winter patties that do not contain any pollen or pollen substitute patties, these do have some advantages. If you're not stimulating the colony, the queen is getting the much needed rest she needs from constantly laying eggs. Less brood production will also mean fewer workers that are produced in fall and winter. So this smaller cluster of workers might just be enough to stay warm, and also it will conserve the food reserves within the colony during the overwintering months. And a break in brood also means that there would be a break in the mite cycles. When it comes to feeding sugars, beekeepers often provide sugar supplements in the form of sugar syrup made from cane sugar or beet sugar. It could also be granules or fondants depending on the season and the colony needs. And I will talk about it in the subsequent slides. But if you are directly providing high fructose corn syrup, or if you're making invert sugar syrup by adding cream of tartar or citric acid, HMF or hydroxymethylfurfural is a is sort of like a side product that is produced due to this chemical inversion, which can be toxic for bees above 30 parts per million. So we have to be careful that we are not overheating high fructose corn syrup, or we are not overheating any invert sugar syrup that we are producing, because it can produce HMF or hydroxymethyl as a byproduct. A lot of beekeepers also often tend to feed their colonies probiotics, and this is a relatively new area of supplemental feeding that we are still trying to understand. There is limited understanding and actually a lack of peer-reviewed scientific evidence. Uh, Kirk Anderson had published a paper relatively recently where he found some negative effects or no effects of providing these commercial probiotics to the colonies. There are also some studies which have shown that they have harvested bacterial strains that are present within the bee guts. So they harvested lactobacillus found within the honeybee guts. They cultured that lactobacillus and then they fed that lactobacillus back to the honeybees in controlled lab case studies where they found some beneficial effects. So truly at this point, what would be impacts of these probiotics on colonies over a long-term period is largely unknown. So with that, a sort of like a basic understanding of bee nutrition, let's move into supplementally managing our colonies when it comes to nutrition. So I found this graphic a long time ago, years ago, online, but I truly like it because I think as a beekeeper, this is not what is going on in your head in spring alone, but probably every single day of every year. And probably a lot more than what this cartoon shows. You're constantly worried about your bees and you're constantly thinking about how you can keep your colonies alive. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what we can do from a nutritional perspective, season by season. So in spring, the bees are raising a workforce and obviously mites. They are preparing to swarm. Foraging is also in earnest, and we have to strengthen these colonies that are coming out of winter. So these colonies are usually stimulated and fed with a one-to-one sugar syrup. The months that are most likely these colonies are going to freeze and starve would be anywhere between February and March, and it could depend on the region, even within the state of Washington, because the eastern side could be very different than the middle region, the Cascades, and then on the western side. So tentatively, if it's slightly warmer towards the end of winter or as we are approaching spring, if it gets a little warmer, the bees may start consuming their stored reserves faster. But if we choose to start feeding bees sugar syrup, we have to be prepared to feed continuously till we know that there would be a nectar flow in the landscape. Because the colony was dependent on us and it's going to start expanding rapidly, being stimulated by feeding, and then we stop. But there is also nothing else that is blooming in the landscape. So then that colony most likely would start to crash. So uninterrupted food supply is extremely important. In summer, it's the honey season, and the bees are also in the winter food storage mode. And let's not forget, while we are talking about supplemental feeding for summer, water is extremely important. So when these colonies are transitioning from summer to fall, the honey supers should ideally be off by July, from the beginning to the end, once more depending on the region and that particular year. This will allow the bees to fill the brood boxes with honey and also give us some time to be able to seasonally treat one more time for mites if required. I usually treat colonies for mites definitely in spring and also during this transition phase. In fall, we are trying to prepare these overwintering workers to have enough food reserves within their body tissues as well as within the colonies. So these are often called the fat fall bees or the diutinous bees that should be able to overwinter much longer than and survive much longer than the regular workers. So there should be adequate reserves in the hive within the honeybee tissues. Protein must be stored in cells, and the bees are now starting to cluster for warmth. So this is the time that we are going to build these hives back up that do not have adequate honey. We are going to feed them 2-to-1 sugar syrup, and we are going to use an in-hive feeder. If frost happens, we stop feeding liquid sugar syrup. If additional sugar is needed, this is the time point when we start feeding them some form of a dry or a solid form of sugar. It could be granulated sugar or it could be fondant. During this time, the bees are, of course, they are clustering, they are generating warmth. Depending on the region, they could also be raising some young. We have to be careful that the colony has enough food reserves because they are going to use honey for food, and they are also clustering in the hive. I am part of a national effort which is led by Auburn University, and it is called the Winter Brood Monitoring Project. So we monitor our colonies throughout these overwintering months to try and see how much brood is being produced between different locations across different regions. And you will be surprised that even within the same state, between different regions, within that same state, there could be a certain amount of brood that continues to be produced during this large overwintering month range. So, even though we are assuming that the bees may not be producing any brood, they may be raising a tiny amount of larvae during this time. In winter, there should be an adequate population of these fat fall bees. There should be enough honey stored. There should also be adequate ventilation because cold bees are bad. Cold and wet bees are actually miserable. And in warmer winters, we should also watch out for food resources in the hive. If the winter is warm, they're obviously going to eat faster, so we have to be careful on replenishing it as needed. If the winters are warm, we should resort to the fall formula, which is 2 to 1 sugar syrup, and feed them that liquid syrup during warmer winters. Or we switch back to the dry sugar feeding. But one thing we must remember is that our main goal is to leave enough food in the colony so that they can overwinter successfully. Because it's only the strong hives that can spare these workers from the winter cluster to go and get enough moisture to liquefy that dry form of sugar that we are feeding during a winter emergency. In other words, a weaker colony would always suffer. So leaving ample honey in the hive for overwintering is always the first thing that we should worry about. And how much is enough in our region? My Togo person is always an experienced local beekeeper because they have been beekeeping for decades and they can actually help you out. So they can tell you how much honey that you need to leave for your particular colony size for that particular year, given the seasonal fluctuations. So from a larval perspective, to your left, this is what a well-nourished larva looks like. So they are puffy, they are white, they are floating in these pools of brood food. On the other hand, to your right, this is what starved dry larvae they look like. As you can see clearly, there is not enough brood food within those individual cells. So from a colony perspective, this is what you're looking at. If you see this, typically these are signs of starvation. You might have every last worker with its head down in the cells looking for the last drop of honey where it starved and then it froze. The winter cluster might be small, the food reserve might be far away that they could not break from the cluster and go and get those food reserves. So these are typical signs of starvation in the colony. So going back to that supplemental feeding guide, towards the end of that feeding guide, you are going to find these tables which have listed so far, what do we know? This guide was published in 2024 January. So this is a work in progress and I'm hoping to update it every 5 years. So if you have any suggestions or if any ways that you think I can improve, please let me know because I'm going to keep on adding more and more information as we know more about it. But if you look at the end of the supplemental feeding guide, you're going to come across a lot of information, one of which is a set of tables. Whatever we know about these artificial diets or homemade paddies, that has been listed here in this supplemental feeding guide. So are there positive effects? Are there neutral effects? Are there negative effects? Some of those you can actually go back and look more at it. Similarly, this table shows you about homemade patty formulations. Also, at the end of the supplemental feeding guide, I have listed interviews with 6 different commercial beekeepers who have different beekeeping operation types. So they could be honey producers, they could be commercially pollinating, they could also be queen breeders, and they are present at different regions within the United States. So, if you are a beginner beekeeper, or if you're thinking about switching your beekeeping operation type, this set of interview is actually quite a helpful resource, because these beekeepers, they go in depth about how they nutritionally manage their colonies, what products they feed their colonies, how much they are feeding, and what time of the year they're feeding, depending on the colony need, the season, and their region. This QR code that you see on the screen can also take you directly to the supplemental feeding guide. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions if anybody is present there. My lab website is listed here. My email address is also listed here. If you have any questions or if you would like to reach out to me, please do not hesitate to send me an email. To the top left is a QR code that will take you to my lab website, and to the top right is the QR code which will take you to our Habitat Nutrition Fund Drive. I am happy to take any questions now, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk about supplemental feeding.
So we do have an audience, actually. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? It doesn't look like it right yet, but I do have a question. I noticed that you said that we should take the supers off at the end of July. Is that
Mhm.
something that we should do here in Eastern Washington? And at that point, should we start feeding the 2-to-1 sugar syrup or,
Mhm.
so I
That's
guess,
a great question. So, in Eastern Washington, I would suggest that definitely take them off by the end of July. Be prepared to treat for another round of mites. August, early September, it's still we still might come across a little bit of nectar. So it is also very dependent on that particular year, how the nectar flow is and how the summer is shaping up. But July is when we should definitely target taking those honey super soft, because this will give the colonies time to find and store nectar. This is also the time when robbing happens. So, if needed, we can continue to feed as long as it's warm temperature, the colony is producing brood, we can continue to feed 1-to-1 sugar syrup. But as soon as the temperature starts to drop, and you can see that truly we are in fall, you should always revert to 2-to-1 syrup.
and I guess because in the past, we've traditionally, at least in my experience, we've traditionally taken the supers off at the last,
Mhm.
in July. So I guess
Mhm.
my question is, why should we do it in July? I mean, we've done it at the end of August. So
Mhm.
why should we do it in July instead of August as we've traditionally done it?
Mhm. And that's a great question. This is my first year in Eastern Washington, so I might come back and change this next year. But I have, at least personally, with my research colonies, I take it off in July so that I could treat them with some miticides. And I just let the bees go back and store as much as they can. I also have a lot of different colonies, and I'm talking about it from a bee researcher perspective. I also have colonies that might be monitored over winter months for multiple different things. So taking the honey supers off in July gives me time to be able to manage them and also work with them the way that I need.
Okay, and then when you take the supers off in July, do you, how do you determine whether or not you should start feeding at that point? Do you weigh them or, um,
Mhm.
how,
So when we take the supers off and we let those bees, I give them about a week and a half before I start feeding them. I just let them try and find things in the landscape naturally. And I necessarily don't go and open every colony and check every frame. I try and lift the box and see if it feels light, I would go in and feed.
Okay, so you're basically weighing them, only you're not doing it with a scale. You're
No,
doing it based
no.
on your
No,
experience.
because sometimes we can have over 100 colonies spread across multiple locations. In some years, we might be also looking at 200 colonies. And especially when you're looking at it, so this is my first year at WSU. And I'm talking about my experience as a faculty member from Mississippi State University. But at WSU, there is even a larger number of colonies. So at one point, we might even be looking at 400 colonies that we might have to manage over the winter months. So it's much easier to go ahead and feed everybody in the yard.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. One
Mhm.
is, where can we go to learn more and help with your citizen science project that you mentioned on natural habitat for bees?
Thank you. Great questions. You can reach out to me, or you can also reach out to Ellen and Dawn Beck at WASPA because I'm partnering with them to be able to reach out to more volunteers. Uh, this is the project that we are launching. So, this is called the Habitat Nutrition Project. And a part of that would be the Pacific Northwest Pollen Atlas. So, we are going to recruit citizen scientist volunteers. We need at least one colony to be present in each location that you're volunteering from for 12 straight calendar months. If you can continue to do that year after year for us, even better, because we will have a better understanding of the pollen flow in that location, or rather in that region. Um, Please reach out to me or reach out to Ellen or Dawn, and then we can share more information with you.
Okay, I've posted the email for WASBA in the chat, and so people who are interested in the science citizen science project, if you want to just email WASBA, somebody will get back to you. Another question is, what mite treatment do you prefer?
I am leaning more towards oxalic acid. We've done a bit of amitraz, so we switch between amitraz and oxalic acid. Formic acid hasn't really worked well for us in high heat in Mississippi and humidity, so we've always gone with either these amitraz or oxalic acid treatments, and I try and switch between them. I don't use the same thing consistently. I switch between the treatments, even within the same year.
When you say you switch between treatments, do you switch between different chemicals, or do you switch between different applications of oxalic acid?
Between different chemicals. So what I've traditionally done at Mississippi, it would be amitraz in spring, oxalic acid in fall.
Okay, great. Um, another question is, what weight should the hive be? I assume the questioner means going into winter,
Mhm.
but maybe not.
Assuming it's about going into winter, that's a very difficult question to answer because it completely depends on your colony. Even for that supplemental feeding guide, I gave very average ranges. If you're in southern US, you're probably looking at warmer winters, longer forage span, shorter overwintering periods, so perhaps 40 to 45 pounds of honey might be enough. If you're in the mid region, perhaps 80. Up in the northern region could be 120 to 150 pounds. I mean, it is an extremely difficult question to answer because how strong is the colony going into overwintering? What does that cluster look like? Do you have a two box colony versus a single box colony? Depending on that, I think we should make sure that my to go is always that at least for a single box of colony, another box should be full of honey frames.
So, I think you answered this before, but there's a question that says, I just got my first nuke a week ago and plan on feeding through the winter. I started on with 1-to-1 sugar syrup to help with drawing out more comb. I don't anticipate trying to get any honey supers this year. When should I switch to 2-to-1 sugar syrup?
I would say watch for dipping temperatures. If consistently, say, the higher temperatures are late 50s, I would probably start switching it because the queen also reduces her egg laying based on the photo period. The shorter the days, the faster she's going to start slowing down. You know what I mean? So she's going to slow down a lot with shortening days and also the temperatures dropping. So that would be the point when you should immediately switch to 2-to-1. It helps them also store it in the colony. Traditionally, it is believed that 1-to-1 is for stimulating and 2-to-1 helps them store it.
So, Doug and Ellen, you might want to chime in as well. I would probably, based on what Priya is saying, I would probably start doing 2-to-1 in the second week of September. depending on the temperature. That's about the time the temperature
Mm-hmm.
starts to
Be
drop
around
off.
the 50s?
Yeah, I would say
Okay.
September 15th,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Um, so again, traditionally, although I'm based on what you've been talking about, I may change this. Traditionally, we've taken the supers off in August and then we just
Mm-hmm.
feed 2 to 1 at that point. But
Okay.
the temperatures are still high at that point,
Mm-hmm.
in late August.
No, and that's a valid point because each region is different. And truly, you're right. Supplemental feeding should depend on the colony, the region, and that particular season. For example, in northeastern Mississippi, when I was a faculty there in at Mississippi State University, it was insanely hot through the end of September, even towards the beginning of October. So we tried, and we had this fall flow that was happening. There was this absolute dearth in mid-summer, and then there would be sudden rain. And then towards the end of summer, we would have another flow coming in. So, which is why our nutritional management is slight different than what would be applicable for Eastern Washington. What's applicable for Eastern Washington would be slightly different for Western Washington. So I think you should continue to watch the weather. And as Margot says, that just be prepared for that particular region for your that particular season and what your colony needs, because it might be warmer September, it might be a very cold September. So just keep watching the weather to make these better informed decisions.
So I do have another question.
Hmm.
We know that sugar syrup isn't quite like nectar. Do
Hmm.
you ever add any supplemental things to the sugar
Hmm.
syrup like Honey Bee Healthy or something like that?
That's a great question, and I have been asked this many times. I don't.
Oh.
I I'm a scientist, so sometimes I think through before I do something, and I'm probably a forever skeptic. But if there is enough peer-reviewed research on a particular supplement, I would definitely be more inclined towards using it. But that doesn't mean that you should not, if you do want to try out different supplements, uh, mistakes should be cheaper, at least in my perspective. So maybe try with one colony and see how that goes. I will say that I am part of the Project APSM colony loss survey results that we are currently looking into this past year. And I will not be able to share everything that we found because we are currently working on the manuscripts. But given beekeepers' supplemental feeding practices, there are quite a few beekeepers spread across the US who have been using a lot of these supplements for sugar syrup. It could be honeybee healthy, it could be the rocket fuel, it could be a lot of different things that beekeepers use. But I'm neither for or against using a particular supplement. Me personally, I would wait and see if any of them are actually making any sort of like benefits in a scientifically measurable way.
Okay, we have another question. How long is 1 to 1 sugar syrup good before it turns bad in the hive? How long can you keep something in?
That's a great question. Would also depend on the weather. If it's hot and humid, it will mold faster. If the bees are hungry, they are going to consume it pretty fast. Uh, you come back and you see an empty in-hive feeder. So it really depends. I have seen, at least in the southeast, about every 7 to 10 days, if they are not consuming it, I would replace it. What would be the weather here like, Margot? Because it is pretty dry here, right, in Eastern Washington. So maybe
Uh,
they last longer?
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't have the humidity that you have
Hmm.
in the South, but I would say in July and August, if they're not
Hmm.
taking it, you might want to also change it out every 7 to 10 days because
Hmm.
it could turn into uh sugar syrup wine. It might ferment.
Absolutely. That was the problem that we had there. In peak summer, peak humidity, it was even shorter. Maybe 5 days. You have to change it out.
Yeah. So, are there any more questions from the audience? Doesn't look like it. But we did have a good set of questions from the audience. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much, Priya, for the information about supplemental feeding for honeybees. This will be recorded on Facebook Live if people want to view it later, and we also put it on to the WASPA YouTube site. Next month, we are going to have somebody talking about wasps and their relationship to the beekeeping community. It'll be the third Thursday of July, which I believe is the 17th, but I'm not sure. But it's at the third Thursday at 6:30 p.m. here on Facebook Live. And thank you, everyone, for participating. Again, Priya, thank you so much.